Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sony FE 400 to 800mm f6.3-8G, a super telephoto zoom lens for full-frame E-mount mirrorless cameras. Announced in February 2025, it becomes Sony's longest lens in their system so far, which previously had only reached 600mm with either the professional f4 prime or the 200 to 600 zoom. Costing around $2,900, it's priced roughly half as much again as that 200 to 600 and aimed at those who are willing to sacrifice the convenience of its shorter and broader range for concentrating mostly on small and distant subjects, most obviously birds. But the lens can also suit other types of wildlife, not to mention distant sports like surfing or skiing, as well as solar or lunar photography. It can also deliver unique perspectives on urban or natural landscapes. And in this review, I'll show you what it can do. Design-wise, it's closest to the 200 to 600 from 2019, which you can see here. This older model is a little narrower and shorter too, but size-wise they're in a roughly similar ballpark, and importantly both employ internal zooms. The 200 to 600 is 360 grams lighter though, and also sports a brighter f5.6 to 6.3 aperture, plus again it's cheaper. And remember, you could always mount a 1.4 times teleconverter, turning it into a 280 to 840 f8 to f9. And that's a combination that I'd be curious to compare to the new 400 to 800. And just out of interest, here's Canon's alternative to both lenses, the RF 200 to 800 f6.3-9 from 2023. At around $1,900, it costs roughly the same as the Sony 200 to 600, while reaching further to 800mm, albeit with a dimmer aperture. The broader range makes it more flexible than either of the Sony zooms, at least on paper, but it's important to note that the Canon 200 to 800 employs an extending barrel, and that's slower and more ungainly to operate than the lighter internal zoom of both Sonys. Okay, now let's take a closer look at the design and controls. The lens is of course sealed against dust and moisture, including a rubber grommet at the mount. It's fairly light for the specification, but at the best part of 2.5 kilograms, you certainly know you're carrying it around. I mostly used it handheld during my tests, but for longer periods you kind of want a monopod to take the strain or something to lean against. Closest to the mount are 5 switches to control the focus and optical stabilization, including 3 focus ranges and 3 OSS modes. Next comes a dial to unlock the collar, allowing the lens barrel to rotate by 360 degrees. There's dots to help you align at 90-degree intervals, but sadly no notches with clicked feedback. The collar can't be removed from the lens barrel, and neither can the tripod foot underneath, and I should note that it is not shaped as an Arca-Swiss dovetail either. That would have been far too useful, right? But like other super telephotos, you can at least use this foot as a carrying handle. And the foot itself has 1/4 and 3/8 threads with a hole for a locking pin in between. Next comes a 3cm wide manual focusing ring, which is damped nicely and turns very smoothly. The minimum focusing distance is 1.7 meters at the 400mm focal length, or 3.5 meters when zoomed to 800mm. Sandwiched between the focus and zoom rings are 3 customizable focus hold buttons. And finally there's the zoom ring itself, generously wide at 6 centimeters. The throw from 400 to 800 is a mere 70 degrees or so, which coupled with a surprisingly light mechanism allows you to quickly and easily adjust the focal length. It's similar to the 200 to 600 in this regard, and both lenses are in some contrast to the super-tele zooms with extending barrels that can be quite a struggle to adjust quickly, as their design means that you're having to move the heaviest front elements, and that typically requires a stronger twist while also changing their balance. I really noticed the difference when photographing fast-moving birds in flight, where I was able to quickly twist the zoom ring on the Sony between my thumb and middle finger across the entire range without letting go of the barrel or adjusting my grip. It's a very practical lens to use for fast reactions. Finally, at the end is a substantial 105mm filter thread and a bayonet for the supplied cylindrical hood. This adds another 10 centimeters to the total length of the lens when fitted, but the rubber tip allows you to stand it up securely when not in use. There's also a sliding window in the hood to access rotating filters. Moving on to the optics, there's 27 elements in 19 groups with optical stabilization built in and an 11-blade diaphragm system. The 400 to 800 range of course represents a fairly modest 2x zoom, so you'll need to ensure that it's going to be a good fit for your target subjects, and they're most likely to be distant birds or sports like surfing or again skiing. If you'd like more reach, the lens is compatible with both the 1.4 and 2x teleconverters, but at that point the aperture will have become very dim indeed, and it's going to be proving an even bigger challenge to the autofocus systems in your body. Speaking of the aperture, the maximum value of f6.3 is available between 400 and 482mm, before reducing a third of a stop to f7.1 between 483 and 590mm, before finally dimming another third to f8, and that's between 591 and the maximum 800mm. Okay, now you're looking at the lens at 400mm 6.3, focusing on a bottle from about 5 meters away in single AF mode with a central area using an A7 IV body. Here you can see an occasional wobble as the AF system locks onto the target, but even when it misses and has to catch up, the entire rack is pretty quick. Switch the camera to continuous AF though, and there's a boost in speed, accuracy and consistency. It also supports cameras that can shoot photos at 120 frames per second or video at 240 frames per second. And now for the lens at 800mm f8, again from a distance of about 5 meters, where you'll see a similar story. There's some misses where the lens and camera overshoot, but it always recovers from these pretty quickly, and again switching to continuous AFC will improve the speed and confidence. And here's one of the typical target subjects, atop a nearby roof and with the lens at 800mm f8. I'm using bird subject detection here on the A7 IV, where the camera has locked onto the eye throughout most of this recording. I'll talk about moving subjects in just a moment. But before that, a video autofocus test at 400mm 6.3 using a single area and AFC mode. The aperture may not be particularly bright or challenging, but if the subject is sufficiently close, you can still achieve substantial background blur. And now at 800mm f8, where again the A7 IV easily pulls focus between the bottle and the background. And again, even at f8, you can see the potential for blurring in the background when the subject's close. At this point in my reviews, I'd normally be walking towards the camera, but my garden's not long enough for this lens, so over to Percy Pigeon here on Brighton Pier. Thanks, mate. Oh, and for all the Steven Seagal fans out there, here he is enjoying a stroll along the front, keeping a sharp eye open for any unsuspecting tourists enjoying their chips and donuts. In fact, I quite enjoyed filming video with this lens and found you could just about handhold short clips with the aid of optical stabilisation and IBIS, but again, before long you are going to be looking for somewhere to rest it. Now, testing the quality of super telephotos in a formal way can be a bit of a challenge, from subjects which have measurable detail across the frame into the corners, to the very long distances which can often suffer from atmospheric or heat distortion. So rather than doing my normal lens tests, I'm going to talk you through a selection of photos that I took of a variety of subjects under different conditions, and I'll discuss how the lens performed. These were all taken with the A7 IV body, as it was the best option that Sony had available to loan at the time of testing. I did want an A1 or an A7R5, but they weren't available. I do have to start with a shot of Brighton Pier though. It's just a bit tighter than normal. So here's the lens at 400mm with the aperture wide open at f6.3. In fact, all the photos I'll be showing are at the maximum apertures, as you're unlikely to want to close it down any further. This shot is sharp in the middle, where the lens was focused, while moving out into the corners maintains the detail. I also reshot this at smaller apertures and found no difference to the sharpness, only the depth of field. Next for the same subject, but at 800mm, this time with the maximum aperture dimming to f8. And the first thing you'll notice is the modest range of the lens, again just 2 times. In use it feels more like having a long prime lens that you can tweak a little bit in either direction, rather than the flexibility of a broader zoom. Once again, the details look good in the middle and stay sharp into the corners. Okay, now for some birds, as this is going to be the major subject for this kind of lens, and due to my location on the UK south coast, it's going to be mostly dominated by seabirds. So first, an urban seagull portrait at 800mm f8, showing the kind of separation you can expect when both the subject and the background are both quite far away. It's obviously not going to be hugely blurred under these conditions in the background, but at 800mm there is the chance to really narrow down exactly what is in the background and its position on the frame. If you can get a bit closer to your subject, you'll enjoy even greater blurring as seen here, and again at 800mm it was easy to adjust the background to contrast with the subject by only shuffling a little bit to the side. Zooming into the subject reveals a decent degree of fine detail. Obviously I used bird detection here and unsurprisingly it found it. In fact, if your birds are large and fairly tame, you could easily find yourself with the chance of making a head and shoulders portrait without any cropping as seen here. This was again taken at 800mm f8 and there's really nice detail around the eye and feathers. But so far all of these have been mostly static birds, essentially portraits. How about birds in flight? So here's some sequences I took with the lens, again mostly at 800 f8, using the full focusing area and with bird subject detection. In use, I'd generally find the subject at 400mm before then flicking the zoom ring to 800 for a closer view. As noted earlier, this is quickly and easily done thanks to the short zoom throw and the internal mechanism. It also allowed me to quickly zoom back out to 400mm if the subject got too close. But the focusing experience with the Sony a7 IV was a mixed bag. Roughly half the time I found the lens and camera would overshoot the target and rack throughout the entire range before locking on. Luckily this was still pretty quick, but it was frustrating and caused me to miss a number of shots. Now the focus distance limiter switch could improve the situation, but I still found many occasions where the lens would still rack back and forth even when the subject was pretty clear in the frame. Now this could be due to a number of factors. For starters, it's an early sample of the lens, but I think it's more about the combination of a very long focal length and fairly dim aperture, which simply presents a bigger challenge to an autofocus system. Add darker conditions around dawn or dusk and things are going to get harder still. I should also note that the a7 IV doesn't sport Sony's latest autofocus and subject recognition, and I really noticed it versus the more recent bodies that I've tested. Bottom line is, I'd recommend pairing this kind of lens with a more recent body from the a7R V onwards because they all feature Sony's latest autofocus processor. Dear viewer, I did request one of these recent bodies for testing the lens, but during January they were all booked out for some far less interesting political event. Go figure. Moving on, the range is also ideal for distant sporting action, but in the absence of anyone braving the surf during the winter time of testing, I pointed it at some cyclists instead, here using human subject detection, and again, all at 800mm f8. I tried to aim for some examples where the background was sufficiently distant to give an idea of the kind of blurring you could achieve under these conditions. Not huge, but then it's not a super telephoto prime lens either. Long lenses are also great for lunar photography, so here's a fairly youthful moon at, you guessed it, 800mm f8, although actually handheld while I was leaning against a bench. Zooming in for a closer look shows some nice crater detail. This was taken at 500th of a second at 800 ISO, and if you'd like to know more about moon photography, I've got a tutorial all about it for you. You can find it on my channel. And of course here's a mandatory sunset, first at 400mm as I've clearly forgotten all about the shorter end of this zoom range, and now again at 800mm of course. Now these were both unfiltered as the sun was low enough and behind sufficient cloud to not pose a risk, but obviously be very careful with any kind of solar photography. Again I took these shots handheld, leaning against a post. I love how at these really long focal lengths you can see the bumpy surface of the sea in the distance rather than just having a smooth line across the horizon. Which brings me to my final verdict and more sample photos for you taken with the lens on an a7 IV body. The Sony FE 400-800mm f6.3-8G is a super telephoto zoom for those who mostly shoot small and distant subjects, most obviously birds, but also certain types of animals or sporting action. Not only does it sport the longest reach in Sony's E-mount catalogue to date, but with a short 2x range that's quite unique in the industry as a whole. It obviously lacks the greater flexibility of Sony's 200-600 in order to concentrate on the long end, and only you'll know if this better matches your requirements. But again, if you generally shoot at the long end of every zoom and just wish they went a bit longer still, then it could be right for you. In terms of quality, it's pretty sharp across the frame at all focal lengths and subject distances both near and far. It also performs well at the maximum aperture, but at a fairly modest f6.3-8 you're unlikely to be stopping it down anyway. The build quality and feature set are both excellent, and I particularly like the internal zoom with a short throw that's easy to flick back and forth with just your thumb and middle finger. It allows you to be very responsive when reframing a moving subject. Unsurprisingly, there's not a great deal of background blur with a maximum aperture of f6.3-8, and in turn this modest light gathering power will place greater challenges on your body's AF system, especially as conditions become dimmer. I often found that my lens sample was racking through the entire focusing range when shooting with the a7 IV body that was supplied for testing, and while the limiter switch could reduce the range of distances, the lens and camera combination would still often rack between them before locking on. To be fair, this still happened fairly quickly and it could be an early sample issue, but I have experienced it on other long lenses with dim apertures. Ultimately, they are what they are. This is the compromise if we can't afford the cost or want to lug the weight of a brighter super telephoto. But it also reminded me how much better recent cameras have become at subject detection, and if you have an older Sony body, you may actually want to consider upgrading it before investing in a lens like this. For example, you could alternatively spend a bit more on an A7R5 body with the latest autofocus system and 61 megapixels, giving plenty of opportunities to crop in with a more modest lens. Ultimately, the 400-800 is an unashamedly specialist lens, but one that will appeal to those for whom the 200-600 just isn't long enough. And there's also some merit to the shorter range, accommodating a more responsive and easily balanced internal zoom, and the optics are certainly sharp. Sure, Canon's 200-800 appears to do it all on paper, but its extending barrel makes it less responsive and harder to balance in the field, and that is really important. And regarding that 400-800 range, I never actually felt the need for the Sony to zoom shorter than 400 when photographing birds around Brighton. Indeed, revealingly, I mostly used the lens at 800mm and was quite happy to stay there. So maybe a slightly brighter or lighter 800 prime could be a better answer for me, but if you're photographing, say, wetlands from a kayak or a hide, or maybe water sports from a beach, I think you'd be very happy with 400-800. And that's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did find it useful, you can support my work with a like and a follow. Just 2 simple clicks that are very much appreciated. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.